Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is lecture 33, Safety at Work. All right, lecture 32, we finished up chapter 11, talking about workplace challenges, and that included talking about scheduling and shift work, and breaks and rest and fatigue, and finally commuting. And that was a fairly short lecture for a straightforward chapter. And now we are going to start chapter 12 and talk about safety at work. We'll begin by talking about some statistics regarding safety in the U.S., in particular in the workplace. And then we're going to talk about the relationship between workplace conditions and safety at work. And then the relationship between personal factors and safety at work. And then we're going to talk about accident prevention. And finally, we'll talk about workplace violence. All right, let's get into some statistics. Overall, in the United States, accidents are the fifth leading cause of death. This is everybody, not just at work. Most of those fatalities don't actually happen at work, but you know, every accidental death is a tragedy, and organizations also have tremendous amounts of liability associated with fatalities that happen at their location or under their response because they're paying for it. So you have the double human tragedy with the financial tragedy, the financial impact, and so trying to drive workplace fatalities to zero is the aim of almost every organization. Now, of the deaths that happen in the workplace, accidents are the leading cause. So if you die in the workplace, the number one, you're more likely to have it be due to an accident than, say, a heart attack or something like that. And so in 2019, pre-COVID here, there were over 5,000, so the 5,303 documented workplace fatalities that occurred. And in order of, what was their cause, or what do we attribute that to? The number one thing was transportation accidents. So there are lots and lots of people that drive their vehicles for their job, both trucks and pickups and delivery vehicles, and just driving in between locations for work, and having an accident on the roads is a common source of workplace fatalities, and that exceeds the other causes here. So the next one is falls and slips and trips. And then the next one is violence. And the next one is some form of equipment malfunction. And the next one would be exposure. That could be toxic chemicals or a lack of oxygen environment. You go into a tank and it's full of CO2 and not enough oxygen. And then lastly on this list anyway is fires or explosions. Now, 90% of people that die due to a workplace fatality are men, and it shouldn't be too surprising considering the tendency for dangerous jobs, to be dominated by males. But there's a lot of deaths, and it's a lot of men doing that dying. Sort of as an aside, because it is sort of a statistical aberration, because we had a once-in-a-century pandemic, there were 3,600 healthcare workers that died in 2020 due to COVID-19. And those are, in many cases, those are due to the virus being acquired at work as healthcare workers. And then also in 2020, injuries and non-fatal illnesses affected 2.7 million workers. In this case, slips and falls, and I presume from an illness standpoint, I do not know for sure, but I would surmise that COVID is not in this list as a non-fatal illness. It's possibly documented elsewhere, but because I would suspect that might be number one, depending on how you want to define it. But in terms of like what are called OSHA recordables, which is where you had somebody slipped and fell, and you had to document that as a non-fatal injury that required some level of care. According to that data here, slips and falls outnumber people who were injured by equipment, which outnumbered people who overexerted themselves. Now, it used to be many years ago, when there would be a workplace accident, people would look to the cause, and they would try to drive that down to, Bob forgot to press the safety button, or forgot to lock out something, and get it down to a human error. And human error as a cause is, may have been viewed by the organization as a way to some extent absolve themselves of responsibility, because this employer didn't do what they were supposed to do. But in today's safety culture in most organizations, that's really not an acceptable way of looking at causes anymore. The responsibility is really put on the overall system, the culture, the processes, and what is it about the workplace that could be improved. Even if it was a human error, even if somebody forgot something, well, what is your training program, or was that person fatigued? And so the cause is looked at. What are the things you can control? You can't necessarily control the humans in your system. But you can do things to keep them in an unsafe, where their optionality of what they can do doesn't result in unsafe things. You can do things to make sure that they're probably well rested and well trained and all those sorts of things. So root cause is really aimed at what can you do in your systems and culture and controls and policies to prevent future accidents. Another thing about these stats, deaths are kind of hard to not report, but a lot of accidents and injuries are believed to go unreported for a number of reasons, and some of that is because people can discount how severe something is, and so they just don't report it. Some people are unaware that they work for an organization that tells them you need to report these things, so they just aren't aware of the process. And then in some places they fear a retaliation. They feel they're going to get in trouble if they report their own injury, because it's like, what did you screw up? And they may be afraid of their job. People might be pressured. Hey, if our safety metric goes down, we're not going to win this government contract, or our insurance is going to go up, and we won't be able to make payroll. And there might be pressure within the organization brought on to people that make them feel like they shouldn't report it. And then some people are just embarrassed to admit that they got hurt. All right, so let's talk about how workplace conditions can affect safety at work. And the ways that that happen sort of vary by industry. So the types of industries have different types of workplace conditions. So an example shouldn't be a huge surprise: the construction industry and people in transportation. Typically, that's the top of the list. For encountering dangers at work. In the construction environment, you're literally putting together a structure, and it's very difficult to do that in a way that you always have all of the safety structures in place that you would when the structure's done. There's things that they do. People put harnesses on, people put guardrails, but if you've ever watched like construction workers put up a roof on a big apartment building or something, or somebody with a pumper truck, which is a big cement truck that can move cement down sort of a articulated or a folded hose, and there's some person like usually guiding that pumper truck, and there's tons and tons of weight rolling around, and it is very unforgiving. There's just a lot about the construction environment that is difficult to make completely safe. And then with transportation, of course, it's impossible at this point to make road accidents go to zero. So the kinds of conditions that relate to safety at work, vary by industry. Another thing that workplace conditions that affect safety is the hours. So we talked about schedules in the previous lecture, and the night shifts have a higher rate of accidents than the days. People are fatigued. Lighting is also can be a factor. Certainly outdoor conditions where you're at dusk, and this might then be a construction accident or a transportation accident or something else. But if you can't see very well and you're have an impaired vision that way, it can affect safety. Temperature. So like right at room temperature is sort of the sweet spot, but the colder you get, the more, you might have harder time with fine motor controls as your hands get cold, and, you start not being able to be as dexterous, and if you're dealing with tools and that sort of thing, you could slip. And then as it gets hotter, a lot of times, obviously things like your sweat can affect your vision to some extent, but really it's just fatigue. You just get tired, and the other thing is when you're cold or really hot, now you have to actually spend a certain amount of your attention towards staying warm or cooling off, and sometimes that can make you take your eyes off the ball, so to speak, if your safety in your particular role actually requires vigilance, which certain more risky professions do. And then another thing from a condition standpoint is the equipment. The equipment people work with, it can be poorly designed. It can be improperly maintained. People might not know how to use it, and that can result in accidents and injuries. And then whether or not you have appropriate safety measures, safety devices, guarding and shields, and two-hand pressing of factory machinery, and those sorts of things. So improper or inadequate or simply not present at all, safety interlocks and shielding and those sorts of things can increase accidents and injuries. And then just general pressure. Is there pressure to deliver? Is there pressure to get something out on time? Is there pressure to move forward anyway, even though you don't have enough resources, that you have to sort of skip steps or rush? And then when you look at what you can do, if you've identified your workplace conditions that are potentially unsafe, the approach to address it is through what's called a hierarchy of controls, and in the order of most effective to least effective. The first thing is basically, can you get rid of the thing that you've identified as a safety hazard? Can you make it go to 0? That would be the most effective thing. Now you no longer have that hazard. And a second most effective thing is, can you substitute that with some other thing that maybe it's not maybe you didn't take the hazard to 0, but what you replaced that hazard with is maybe lower risk, and making a safer working condition that way. And then there's these things called engineering controls, and we'll talk about engineering controls and administrative controls, and we'll bring that one up too. So an engineering control, you can think of that as like a physical thing. So that's like shielding. That's like these doors don't open unless you have the right badge, and your badge only gets activated if you've gone through the safety training. That's a common thing for access. Think of engineering controls are physical things designed into the equipment or the facility that make it such that the worker themselves is isolated from the hazard. So that might mean that the thing that has all the high voltage, or thing that has the high pressure or the temperature, is in a different room, and it's shielded, and if you just open up the door, an alarm will go off and it'll shut the power off, unless you have a special key, and then you only get that special key if you've gone through special training and those sorts of things. And then there's administrative controls, and you can think of that as your rules and your policies. And what you're training people on. So you can think of engineering controls as like physical things, and you can think of administrative controls as like the paper or digital. But basically, that's information that teaches you what the behaviors you're supposed to do and what behaviors you're not supposed to do. These are the safety rules. This is the safety training. These are the policies. The only people that are allowed to go beyond this beyond this hazard line, this yellow warning line, are people that are trained and have officially have these roles, or they wear this color smock, or they have this color badge, or whatever. And if you don't have that, you can't cross that line. Those are rules. The line itself, it can be looked at as an engineering control. The rule, you can look at that as an administrative control, and hopefully that makes sense. And then finally, PPE. I mean, in some cases, PPE can save your life, but I mean, it's generally considered the least effective thing, because once you actually, if you have to use PPE in many cases, that means that a hazard event happened. If you're wearing an eye shield and a big chunk of metal smashes your eye shield, you'll be glad you have your eye shield on. But a number of things failed in order for that to happen. What is it that was going on that caused a big chunk of metal to be flying everywhere? And by going through, can you eliminate it? Can you substitute it? Can you put a shield in? Can you put some policies in place? Those things are generally more effective than the PPE. But if you're wearing PPE in an organization, it's usually because it's identified as either it's not a big burden, like just wear a pair of gloves, or all of the attempts to eliminate, substitute, engineer out, or administrate out don't take the risk to zero. And so the PPE then is there sort of as a last step to physically shield and physically protect the employee. Hopefully that makes sense. And then also on related to workplace conditions and safety, there's you follow OSHA, you follow the federal government's requirements, you follow their reporting procedures, and you follow their guidelines where it's applicable to your particular organization. And OSHA was created within the Department of Labor in 1970. Okay, let's talk about personal factors, behaviors that affect safety at work. First one, we'll talk about alcohol and drug use can contribute to accident rates. And it's common then when there's a workplace accident. Not every place, but it's common in like a warehouse or where people driving forklifts all the time, or certain factories, that if there's been an accident, often that is considered a justification to do a drug test on the person that was involved in the accident. But it's actually difficult to track properly alcohol use and drug use as it relates to accidents. The data is murky in terms of to what extent does somebody drinking on the job cause. I mean, there's times this person was drunk and they were driving a forklift and they ran into something, but a lot of times the alcohol and drug use is difficult to make a strong connection. So it's really not it's not really known in strong consensus exactly how much of a contributor alcohol and drugs are. Health, poor health in particular, can be a contributor to accidents. Like somebody has depression and just isn't attending to something, isn't being vigilant. Somebody that has an underlying condition like osteoporosis, and they slipped on some ice in the parking lot and they broke their hip. They might not have broke their hip if they hadn't had osteoporosis. It's still a workplace accident. It's still the responsibility of the organization that owns that parking lot. And so it's in the organization's best interest to properly train people and keep the ice off their parking lot, just because some people may be at more physical risk than others due to underlying health conditions. And then fatigue is often a factor in accidents. That shouldn't be a surprise. Generally speaking, the more work experience you have doing something, the less risk. I mean, think about the first time you're trying to drive a car versus 10 years later. Generally speaking, that experience allows you to identify risks. It allows you to be more automatic in your reactions, generally speaking. And then there's been some studies that show that highly engaged employees, people that feel that they're empowered, they have autonomy to make their decisions, so they have high job involvement, like they're really engaged in their job. That sort of, this is what I do, this is who I am, kind of full-throated endorsement of your self-endorsement of your role. That's linked to less accidents. Perhaps you're more likely to be attending to what you're doing. Perhaps you're more likely to be thinking ahead. and you certainly would care more about what's going on, and you might be working to make small improvements all the time. Might even just be cleaning. I mean, just keeping a workplace clean and organized is a way to prevent accidents. And then job insecurity, kind of the counter to that. People that just don't feel like that their job is secure. Maybe they're worried about getting laid off, and they don't want to be seen as unproductive or lazy, and so maybe they're cutting some corners. Maybe they're moving a little too fast. Maybe they're skipping steps, and some of that can be unsafe. Not a big surprise. Younger workers, it says works there. Younger workers are more likely to have an accident, but older workers often they're more likely that accident will have serious consequences, and some of that can be like if somebody quite young and healthy slips on the parking lot versus somebody older with a lot of underlying health conditions. I mean, all other things being equal, in both cases somebody could accidentally hit their head, but all other cases being equal, the more underlying health conditions you have, the more risks are. But at the same time, an older worker might be doing the more difficult thing. It depends on the circumstance. So sometimes the older workers those accidents can be more serious. Personality itself, it's only weakly related. Sometimes a temporary emotional state can increase your risk. If you're just really agitated about something and you're not really paying attention, that's more of a situational thing than your underlying personality. And there's really no validity in literature anyway that an individual person, that there's a personality trait of calling accident prone. I mean, this is sort of an anecdotal thing. We all kind of think we maybe know people or have times in ourselves when we feel like maybe that's a thing. But when you actually look at the data and you try to parse it across individuals, nobody's been able to disambiguate, like, here's a questionnaire I can give you, and then I can identify you as having a personality trait of accident proneness. It's not valid at this point. Okay, let's talk about ways that organizations can try to prevent accidents. The first thing is actually getting information of current accidents so that you can make your future have less accidents. So a formal accident reporting system such that all accidents are investigated. And a typical accident report should include things like, when did it happen and where did it happen? What was the job? What was the task involved? Who was involved? What do we know about that person? How much experience do they have? Were they trained in it? And did they get enough sleep last night? Those sorts of things. Just broader, what happened? What was the accident? What was the end result of that? Was there injury? Was there damage? Those sorts of things. I mean, basically, a formalized way of capturing these things so that then they can be analyzed afterwards for on an individual cases and as a broad pattern to try to change your workplace conditions. Doing that, eliminate and substitute engineering control, administrative control, PPE, hierarchy of controls to try to change the workplace so that less accidents happen in the future. Another preventative is training, safety training. That's where you're informing people about what is and isn't unsafe, what behaviors they should avoid, what are good, safe behaviors. I mean, and believe it or not, falls in the parking lot in northern states, in states that have ice, are a big deal. They cost companies lots of money, cause a lot of lost time when people get injured. And so I've regularly, once a year, I get from my employer, I get a thing. We kind of joke about it because it's kind of funny. And it's the Walk Like the Penguin video, where you get reminded as winter's coming on and the ice is going to be showing up periodically on the parking lot before it can be salted and gotten rid of. Is you walk like a penguin. And so there's annual Walk Like a Penguin training, and it's funny, but it's also legit. Because if you remember that, it's icy, and okay, you kind of do these weird little penguin walk. It's more stable. But there's lots and lots of more detailed and very situational to a particular type of equipment or process in terms of safety training, and that's vital. And then so you're teaching people. If you have administrative controls, these are rules and guidelines. You need to teach people what those things are aimed at prevention. You need to teach people what the reporting policy and procedure is. And then there's another thing overall called your safety climate, and that's really a cultural thing. What are the shared beliefs and perceptions around safety? And this is inclusive of your policies and procedures and your practices, but it's also a mindset. It's also the sort of in-group binding narrative of who we are. And you could have a culture, if you're not careful, of we don't worry about those silly rules. We just try to get the job done. Who cares if you have your safety glasses? Who cares, whatever, just get going. Who cares if you have your seatbelt on when you're driving to a job site? Let's just get the work done, That's not a good safety culture. So your safety climate, the general, how safety is or isn't inculcated, so to speak, into the binding narrative has a big impact on how people act. And so that is then part of the organizational culture. Okay, let's finish talking about workplace violence. Murder after accidents is the second leading cause of death in the workplace. It's actually the primary, when you stack up the causes of death for women, it's the murders are the number one cause, and accounts for 42% of female fatalities. And yet, like I said, 90% of workplace fatalities are men. So even with murders, in 2017, of the 458 people documented to have been murdered at work, 375 were men and 83 were women. And then let's talk about what aggression is in terms of IO psychology and looking at the workplace. It's an intentional behavior aimed at harming another person, and that does not have to mean physical violence. So aggression can be looked at across levels. And the first level of aggression, the lowest sort of level of aggression, and this isn't necessarily, you could put like microaggressions in that sort of a part of the current cultural value framework that's going on around us, and that's not in the specificity of these types of IO definitions, but you could kind of look at some microaggressions in this first line here of incivility. In this case, it would have to be intentional to meet this definition, and some things with microaggressions are sort of not explicit in the mind of the person that's using them, but yet they can still be damaging. But at least for these definitions of aggression, it's something you're doing this on purpose to harm another person. So when you're being really rude and incivil to somebody, you actually wish this person you wish this person the ill will that you're demonstrating with your incivility, sort of the lowest level threshold, and then that can move into bullying, and people generally know what bullying is when they see it or feel it. But again, intentionally causing some kind of harm, and then all the way up to harassment, and then finally violence. Physical violence in this case, and none of those are good, and all of those need to be stomped out. Nobody wants to go to work and deal with any of that, and obviously physical violence carries with it liabilities on the organization to the injury and death, and subsequent from just from a sort of selfish organizational standpoint. It's also going to affect your retention. It's also going to affect your recruitment. It's going to affect your sort of brand as an organization if you have a place where you can't keep your people physically safe. But harassment, bullying, and even incivility, all of that make your workplace toxic, and make it a place that people don't want to be at. And it is 100% in the best interest of every organization to get this out of their culture, and to make sure that where it then shows up because of individual bad actors is grabbed onto and expunged, and then the person, in this case the victim, is fully supported. These are things that organizations take very, very seriously, because the people are harmed, and the organization is also harmed from a long-term reputational damage and monetary as well. So very serious things. Safety is number one priority. That's very, very common thing to run into in an organization when they talk about the priorities. They'll say safety is number one, physical safety, and then and sometimes they might articulate it more in terms of emotional safety and those sorts of things. But we want to keep people alive at work. We want to keep people not to get injured at work, and then we want to make our work culture something where people do not feel like anyone is being aggressive towards them, and so then they are physiologically and psychologically safe in their workplace. Okay, that is the end of this lecture for first half of chapter 12. Also a nice short lecture, just half an hour here. So let's recap what we talked about for safety at work. We talked about some statistics. We talked about how workplace conditions affect safety at work. We talked about how personal factors, personal behaviors affect safety at work. We talked about what organizations do for accident prevention, and we finally talked about workplace violence. Next lecture, lecture 34, we're going to do the other half of chapter 12, and we talk about health at work. And so specifically, we'll talk quite a bit about alcohol and drug use at work, and we'll talk about the prevention and the detection and the reduction of alcohol and drug use at work. And this would be, drug abuse, not legal prescription drugs, and those sorts of things. There's certainly abuse of prescription drugs, but that you guys know what I'm talking about. And then we'll talk about how computer use and physical health relate, and then how you can prevent or reduce anyway health-related issues that cause from just sitting in your computer all day long and having bad posture, eye strain, and musculoskeletal strains, and those sorts of things. And then finally, we'll talk about exposure hazards at work. And then that is it. All right. We will see you for the next lecture.